Hello, everyone, and welcome to our third Q&A session of our Wonder Kids Ask a Developmental Psychologist series. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Portia Queevy, and I am the Recruitment Coordinator for the Early Development Research Group at UBC. Dr. Susan Birch, along with her incredible team of researchers at the Kid Study Center, studies how social perspective taking impacts the development of decision-making and the health of children. The Kid Study Center is one of 7 research centers that make up the Early Development Research Group. Because many of the research done by Dr. Birch and her team took place on campus at the University of British Columbia, I would like to acknowledge that our campus is situated on the traditional, ancestral, and ceded territory of the Musqueam people. But of course, this is a virtual event, and so I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners and caretakers of the many lands that you are joining us from both near and far. I will introduce you in just a moment and then open the floor to questions, taking us to about 2 o'clock. To gather your questions, we will be using the Q&A window that you may access via the button along the bottom of your Zoom screen. We'll be going through the questions on the first come, first serve basis, beginning with the questions that got submitted ahead of time through our RSVP form. Please do feel free to pop in and out as you need. We understand that most of you have little ones at home. If you're unable to stay for the entire session or have technical issues, do not worry. We will be posting a recording of the session on the EDRG website. As mentioned, Sue specializes in social development, but does have knowledge in other areas of child development. If you have questions in areas outside of social development, Sue will be happy to share her thoughts on them, but you're welcome to attend future sessions or watch recordings of past talks that cover those topics. I am delighted to introduce Dr. Susan Birch to you today. She is Associate Professor in the Department of Psychology at UBC. She joined the Early Development Research Group in 2004, immediately upon completing her PhD at Yale, thereby continuing her program of innovative research on theory of mind and social perspective taking. Among her awards is the Dissertation Award from the American Psychological Association and the Early Career Scholar Award from the Peter Wall Institute for Advanced Studies. Lately, Sue has been leading a project that explores the social impact of the COVID pandemic on parents and children's social functioning and social emotional health, a study we will share a little bit about today. If you're a member of our EDRG database of families, you may well have received an invitation to participate in this study. And if so, thank you so much for contributing to this important work. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Susan Birch, who will share a little bit about her work before we delve into the questions.
Thank you, Portia. Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. And thanks for the introduction, Portia. I will briefly mention my area of expertise so that people have a sense of the kinds of questions that I'm most capable of answering. However, if you have other questions, I will make an attempt. My area of expertise is in children's theory of mind or perspective taking. So theory of mind is a term we use to refer to children's understanding of mental states. So that includes things like their understanding of intentions, what other people know, their beliefs, their feelings, their desires. And it's sometimes called perspective taking because when we think about another person's mental states, we sort of have to put ourselves in another person's shoes, so to speak, take their perspective and try to make inferences the best we can about what they might be thinking or feeling. And I got really, really fascinated by this area because theory of mind or perspective taking, that is the ability to think about other people's internal mental states and what drives human behavior, is really fundamental when we interact with other people, and it impacts what we learn from others and how we make a variety of decisions, including how we go about communicating with other people. So that's my primary area of expertise, just to give you a window into the kind of research that I do. And maybe I'll start with a little bit of a disclaimer as well, just so you know. The Early Development Research Group is a group of research scientists. So we're developmental psychologists that are research scientists, meaning we study typical development. We're not clinical psychologists, so we don't run a practice where we do individual assessments. We mostly focus on research on how typical development unfolds. So I'll be best at answering questions about typical development, but given I have 10 years of university experience in psychology, I could at least make an attempt at questions outside that, but please by no means consider this clinical advice in any way, shape, or form.
Thank you so much, Sue, for taking us through your work and giving us a little bit of understanding of what to expect in today's Q&A session. Before we start the Q&A sessions, I would like to remind viewers that you can send in your questions as well or through the Q&A box along the bottom of your Zoom screen. We'll be starting with some of the questions that came ahead of time through the RSVP form. Sue, I did want to ask, as just a quick reminder, the question you wanted me to start with.
I saw that a couple of questions had to do with young children throwing temper tantrums. And I know that's such a common question that I thought maybe we could start there. There's a few of those along the line. So,
yeah. Okay, great. Yeah, I think I found one that the question is, how can we support a child after, how can we support attachment between parent and child when the child has been removed from the home due to child protection concerns? And how can we support a child after such trauma has been removed from their life?
Okay. So this is an interesting question about how to support a parent-child relationship, what is sometimes called an attachment. So research shows that the majority of children develop what is called a secure attachment or a secure relationship with their primary caregiver or caregivers, and that can foster all sorts of beneficial social and emotional development. So I think the question has to do with how can we make sure that quality attachment relationship is supported. And in this question that you mentioned, they're talking about, I believe, a child that's been removed from the home. Mm-hmm. And so there's two sides to that. So the question might be about how to support attachment with the parent that is not in the child's life at the moment as often because they've been removed from the home. Mm-hmm. Or I'm not sure how to interpret the question. It might be more about how to support a healthy relationship with whoever the guardian is now. Either way, the question is being asked, the answer is largely the same. There is an acronym that I try to remember that helps with this, and that's SPS. So these are 3 qualities that parents can display that help support a positive attachment style. And so the first S refers to sensitivity or support. By sensitivity, they mean being responsive to the child. So whenever a child is upset, attending to that child and doing so in a consistent manner. So trying to use a consistent form or a consistent parenting strategy. The P stands for positive affect. So trying to have a positive attitude, show a lot of smiling, emotional warmth towards the child, and be emotionally supportive in that way. And then the third letter, the S, the second S stands for stimulation. And in this case, stimulation is not necessarily like bombarding the child or overstimulating them, but just not being neglectful. So in terms of, basically social interaction, interacting with them, talking to them about emotions, reading to them if they're at their appropriate age for that, and just interacting with them in general. So SPS behavior, that is being sensitive, positive, and stimulating, are really good ways to support a healthy attachment with the parent.
That's great. That's really, really interesting. And I guess it's just like, just a follow-up on that is, so would that also help with kind of reducing the effects of the trauma that might have already happened? Because this is just really fascinating to me as well.
Yeah, so even if a child, let's say, has a disruption in their attachment early, maybe this applies here if they've been disrupted from or separated from a primary caregiver, that can be challenging. But all of these behaviors, even presented later in the relationship, can really offset any early difficulties.
Oh, that's really impactful. And then another question is, why does my 1-year-old always throw a tantrum?
Yeah, that's the one I was thinking of.
You're looking for, yeah.
So this young children throwing tantrums is very common. That's part of typical development. You've probably heard the term terrible twos, and as any parent will tell you, it's not specific to 2-year-olds. It start much earlier than 2, so even in 1-year-olds, and it can persist much later than 2 years of age. One way to think about this is that they're making a transition from being a baby to being a toddler or a preschooler. And as a baby, their only form of communicating their needs is to cry. That's the only form of communication they have. And so crying and having an emotional reaction is very natural. It's their sort of main form of communicating when they're young. And they have to make the transition from crying to communicate to our more adult form, which is verbal communication. But language development is a really long, prolonged process, and it's going to take a few years for the child to become proficient and comfortable in language. And so temper tantrums tend to be associated, there's sort of 2 lines of research that I think I'll mention. One is related to language. So if a child isn't yet very proficient in language, even if they have a decent vocabulary, it's still, they're new language learners, and they may not be able to communicate their wants and needs and desires verbally very well yet. And so they will respond with crying as a way of getting their needs met or getting the attention that they're seeking. But the second line of research has to do with what's called inhibition or impulse control. Impulse control is sort of putting the brakes on negative behavior. So, a baby's first instinct is going to be to cry if they're upset. And as they get older, they get better at controlling that impulse. And that has to do with the development of what's referred to as the prefrontal cortex, which sits behind the forehead, if you will. The prefrontal cortex is responsible for impulse control, and it's one of the last parts of the brain to develop. So it undergoes a rapid change from newborn up through the preschool period, and in fact is still developing even as late as 25 years of age. So I guess my best advice is to be patient, to know that they will grow out of this with improvements in frontal lobe development and improvements as they get better with language. They'll be able to communicate more effectively.
That's really interesting that, tantrums are coming out of, the development of the brain. That's really thank you so much for that, Sue. The next question is, my 2-year-old is becoming pickier with his food selection. He doesn't eat an enough amount of his meal, and his weight is decreasing. Is there any stress about eating that he may be feeling?
Interesting. So I don't know a ton about food selection and stress related to food selection. Off the top of my head, I can think of various reasons why a young child might find eating quite challenging. So they're transitioning from a primarily liquid diet to now solids and textures. Some children can be notoriously picky eaters and will have very specific preferences in terms of taste or even texture. My nephew, for instance, was obsessed with anything that was a dip. He needed a dip. His first words, he needed a dip with whatever you were going to serve him when he moved to solid foods, because he didn't like how dry food was, and he needed something that was more liquid and more, I guess, familiar to him, which was his liquid diet. So it could be, that can cause some amount of picky eating. but it could be, it could be there's some physical pain that's worth looking into. Maybe they have a sore throat or sore gums, could be from teething, could be indigestion or stomach pain associated with certain foods. But generally speaking, if a toddler's losing weight, if weight is decreasing, I highly recommend consulting your doctor, your primary care physician, because there's a whole host of things that could be affecting his weight. I will say that toddlers sometimes lose a small amount of weight because they're more physically active, right? They're losing their baby weight and they're starting to walk and be a lot more physically active. So some amount of weight loss could be normal, but if you're noticing a weight decrease, I wouldn't hesitate to see a physician. It's always better to do that. And the other thing I'll say is, I know right now during the pandemic, people might be wary about, putting their child into a healthcare setting or going to the doctor. So just be mindful that most physicians these days allow for online visits, online appointments. And while they may need to do a physical exam on your child, at least that initial visit could potentially be done online as just one option if you are wary of having your young child interact with another stranger.
Thank you so much, Ptsd. Thank you so much for that, Sue. There is a follow-up question on the answer you gave about attachment and trauma. And this question is that, should you still have that ongoing attachment with the parent if they are the source of your PTSD, or if they suffer from narcissism and are unaware of what they are doing with you? How does one deal with that?
Do you mind reading that to me again? I don't see that question. And so can you just read that to me one more time?
So the question is, should you still have that ongoing attachment with the parent if they are the source of your PTSD, or if they suffer from narcissism and are unaware of what they are doing with you? How does one deal with that?
Okay, I think I understand the question. So if the parent is a source of PTSD for the child, or the parent suffering from things like narcissism, is it a good idea to support a healthy relationship with that parent? That's a really tough question to answer. So maybe one thing I would say about that is, it's important that the child has a secure attachment with some adult. It doesn't have to be with the biological parent, or if this individual is a source of stress, then they might not be the best person. But the child will need a secure attachment with someone. So as long as there's at least one adult that they have a close relationship with that is providing that SPS behavior, I think that's the most important thing.
Thank you. The next question is, why do children tend to have a lack of responsiveness to injury until a parent shows distress? I've seen this phenomenon in my younger brothers growing up, and not crying until they see parents rushing towards them.
Yes, what an astute observation. This is such a cool phenomenon. This is something I am familiar with. It's called social referencing. And we all do this. So even adults, but kids do this a lot more. But imagine a scenario where, let's say, you're out at a restaurant and some stranger comes in and sits down at your table. Your first reaction is to look to other people, right? If you don't know what to do in this situation, you're going to look to those around you and go, well, what are you thinking? How are you responding to this? And then if your friends look like they know this person and they're comfortable, then you'll be more comfortable. And kids do this to an even greater degree. So when they're very young, they know very little about the world. And in some way, parents know best, or adults know best. So a very young child will really often look to someone they trust, a parent or caregiver, to see, what are you doing in this situation? So if, and we can do this in research studies, we do this where, we'll bring in a new robot or a loud, noisy toy, or a clown will pop in, and the child will always look to the parent. And if the parent has a positive reaction, then the child will have a positive reaction. But if the parent looks worried or anxious or fearful in any way, then the child will typically adopt that behavior as well. And so what I think this person seeing in this reaction is the child fell and may not even be that hurt, but the parent is reacting with concern because they don't yet know, hey, is my kid hurt? And maybe they're hurt and they're reacting with concern. And the child's then seeing that concern on the parent's face and reading that as, oh, something's wrong. I must actually be in pain. And so, I mean, it's completely normal and good that the parents respond with concern, but sometimes just hesitating a little bit with that concern to see if the child's actually hurt can be useful.
That's very interesting. I didn't realize that we all do it, like in like subtle ways. That's really nice. Another question is, it's a follow-up to the first question, and it's in a similar incident. A student I taught in a preschool swimming lesson would act fearlessly in the water until their parents showed up, at which point they would become a complete crybaby. What do you think might cause this behavior?
Yes, I think this is probably the same phenomenon, social referencing, where they're looking and they were good, they were liking this, but then maybe the parent came in and the parent's a little concerned or has, is showing some level of interest and concern, and they might be picking up on the nervousness of the parent and sort of imitating that behavior a little bit.
And this question has to do with speech therapy, and is, how does speech therapy help children develop essential skills?
Great question. Not something I know much about. So this is something my colleagues would actually know more about. They study language development. So one place to look would be, there's a Department for Speech and Hearing Sciences at UBC that might have some resources. I would definitely try to speak to a clinician about this, because I from the little I know, speech therapy, there's a lot of different types, and I do believe they can be quite helpful, especially if they're adopted early. And so, yeah, my recommendation would be to try to reach out to a clinician that's an expert in speech therapy to learn more. And because I know parents might be tempted to go online, and there is a ton of really useful resources online, but it can be hard to know what are quality, credible resources. There's a couple that just general psychology and health resources that I think people should feel they can trust for references, and that would be the APA.org. So APA stands for American Psychological Association. They have a ton of resources for parents, not just about speech therapy, but resources more generally about development. And same with the Canadian Psychological Association, so CPA. And then the two institutes for health. So in the US, that's the National Institute for Health, NIH. And in Canada, the CIMH, the Canadian Institute for Mental Health. Yeah, so NIH instead of NHI, NIH.
Oh, NIH. Thank you for catching us.
So sorry, I don't have a better answer for that. I do believe from the little I know that speech therapy can be super helpful. So I would, reach out to an expert on that.
Thank you so much for that. And just to add on to that, is we did have a session with Dr. Janet Werker, who is an expert in language development and speech acquisition in kids. So you can watch recordings of that on the EDRG website. There may be an answer to that question in that video. Another question is, why does my 3-year-old hit us when we don't use physical punishment with her? Yeah,
that's a really good question. So it could be somewhat tied to the temper tantrum question. So I'll just repeat that it could be due to the fact that they are still developing language abilities and they're still developing impulse control, which will help them control their physical outbursts. So as their language improves and they can communicate without acting out physically, that behaviors should decrease. And as they get older and their impulse control improves, that behavior should also decrease. So I would be really optimistic that this is not something that's going to continue. But I think maybe more of the question is how this one's different from the earlier one is they're saying, you know, we don't do this in the home. So where are they learning this, right? And part of it has to do with the fact that newborns' only form of communication was crying. But it's also, I think, worth noting that kids, even though they will imitate people in their environment, they learn a lot of behaviors that parents don't show them. So they will pick up on cues from other people, not just from parents. And so I think what parents probably want to know is there anything I can do while I'm waiting for my child's language to get better and I'm waiting for their brain to develop? Is there anything that I can do differently? And so what comes to mind is what we refer to as behavior modification. It's a strategy, it's a parenting strategy that the basic principle is this: you want to attend to and praise your child's behavior when they're doing something you like, and try not to pay too much attention to them when they're engaging in a behavior you don't like. So it's really quite challenging, and you won't be able to do it all of the time. It's not realistic to imagine you will be able to do it all the time, but even just keeping that principle in mind, right? So if your child is acting out and they're using physical punishment, your first reaction might be, to be really upset, and inadvertently, you might give them a lot more attention, and they do like attention. And so while obviously you do need to address if they're doing something wrong, trying to not draw too much attention to the negative behavior can be helpful. And the flip side of that is then taking opportunities where they're being calm and they're not using physical punishment. So let's just say they're just sitting quietly, drawing or something like that. Praising that behavior and really being positive about the times where they're being calm and doing the things you like can be really helpful. So if this is something you're interested in knowing more about, Dr. Alan Kasdan at Yale University has been doing this kind of research and with parenting interventions and training parents on how to do behavior modification and use praise and the power of praise. So his work might be something that you might learn more from. But that's the idea, is try to not draw too much attention to the negative behavior, and more praise and more positivity when they're doing the things you like.
And this next question, I think is also similar to the question on trauma, but I guess from a different perspective, and is that how does neglect affect children, either professionally or socially, as they grow up?
That's a really great question. So let's define neglect for a second. If I can tell you how researchers talk about it. They typically talk about parenting styles as being on two dimensions, and that is either high and low on control, or high and low on emotional support. And where researchers sort of define neglect as parents that are low on both. So they're not showing a lot of emotional support, but they're also not showing a lot of involvement in their child's life either. They're sort of, as the word implies, they're sort of neglectful, they're uninvolved or unengaged, and they're really just not spending a lot of time with the child. In general, that style tends to be associated with more negative outcomes for children, especially with regard to their social and emotional development. And there's a lot of examples, a lot of ways that can manifest. So just to give you one idea, parents that are neglecting their child or uninvolved in their child's lives aren't there to provide the appropriate amount of discipline, to encourage independence, or to set, rules, boundaries, even something like, a set bedtime, if you will. And in the absence of boundaries or clear guidance on how to behave, those children then can have difficulties with emotion regulation and impulse control, as an example. They didn't have anyone there to guide them and help them with impulse control. And so it can be associated with negative outcomes. On the positive side, though, fortunately, kids who grow up in a neglectful environment often will seek out a good relationship elsewhere. So often they're not alone, right? Parents aren't the only source of support. They can benefit from, a relationship with an aunt or a sibling, an older sibling, or a cousin or a teacher, and they'll often develop a good relationship with those individuals. And because they have a good relationship with those individuals, they tend to learn more from those relationships.
That's great to know that children can lean on somebody else in times of distress.
Out of school care programs come in really handy. So in disadvantaged homes, when there are interventions, there's often, they get encouraged to be involved in, say, the YMCA, or there's usually other adults that they can look to support healthy development.
And this question is pretty much similar to the one before, and I think you might have answered it a little bit in response to the previous question, but just to go over this one as well. Some children grow up in abusive households and witness conflict and malevolent doings throughout their childhood. When they grow up, they choose to adopt empathy, kindness, and optimism, regardless of how terrible their childhood was. How is this possible? I know philosophical nativism has to do with it, but I would like to discuss more of this as it seems super interesting.
Yes, this is interesting. I too find this fascinating, right? Because we tend to think that we're going to be products of our environment. And while that's true to some degree, it's this complex, bi-directional interaction between nature and nurture. So between our genes and our environment, and the two are heavily intertwined. And so there are a lot of cases where children can come from pretty horrible environments. The example that's in this question is an abusive household, and still end up being super empathic and kind. And that's really, really great news. There's a few things about this. One is I'll echo a point I made in regard to the last question, which is that often there is another adult or another type of relationship in that child's life that, whether it's with a sibling or a teacher, that they will form an attachment or form a secure relationship with that other, and they will model and learn from those other individuals that have healthy behavior. But there's also something that's a little closer to my area of expertise that makes me really fascinated by this as well. And so this has to do with perspective taking. So in general, what we know about how kids learn about how to adopt other people's perspectives and learn about their mental states is that they learn a lot of this from quality interactions with parents, and in particular discussions of mental states. So parents that spend a lot of time talking about, what are you thinking? What are you feeling? Why do you think that? Why does she think that? Mm-hmm. They tend to foster better perspective taking. And so good quality parenting can lead to empathy and kindness and better social understanding. Ironically, but fortunately, highly abusive homes can also sometimes foster better perspective taking, but for very different reasons. And there's not a lot of really good research into this, but this is the theory behind this. The theory behind this is that if there's an abusive individual in the household, the child is highly, highly motivated to be able to predict when those instances are going to occur. And they want to be able to pick up on any social cue, whether it's a facial expression or body language or a particular time of day or instance. They get almost hyper aware of these cues because they want to be able to predict, when is my parent, if it's a parent, when is that person going to respond with an angry outburst. And so they actually spend a lot of time thinking about what are the cues that predict these emotions. And as a result, that may lend itself to better perspective taking outside of the home, because they're thinking about, they become hyper attuned, if you will, to other people's thoughts and feelings.
Yeah. That's interesting. It's like a good outcome from like a bad experience.
Good outcome from a bad situation. Yeah.
This question is also related to stress and, its effect on, children's development, and is how does stress affect brain development? For context, this is stress or distress related to sleep training.
This is a really interesting question. So I'll admit it's not something I know a ton about. And stress can come in a variety of ways. It's important to distinguish acute, short-lived stress from chronic, prolonged stress. So the most negative effects from stress come from that chronic, persistent, prolonged stress. Those can have negative effects on the brain. However, stress is the stress hormone, which is cortisol, and that's ultimately what your brain is receiving and is attuned to. When there's stress, you typically see an increased level of cortisol, and it's advantageous to have a cortisol response. So the reason we have that stress response is it heightens awareness, it heightens arousal, it can help foster learning, and it fosters memory consolidation. And so a little bit of stress is not a bad thing. In fact, newborn babies experience stress at the time of birth for exactly that reason. It actually increases oxygen intake. So a little bit of cortisol is not a bad thing. So if a baby is experiencing short-term stress, as long as it's not too extreme, right? There's balance in all things. Then I wouldn't be overly concerned. But if that is frequent and often and persisting, I'd be more concerned about that. Since this person has indicated that it's in the context of sleep training, the other thing to keep in mind is that, again, I won't want to say I'm not an expert in sleep training by any means. I really don't know anything about it, but I do know that sleep deprivation, it can have negative physical and psychological consequences. And so I guess my first thought is that ultimately, if the goal is to promote a healthy sleep pattern, then that's a good goal, right? That's much better than sleep deprivation, which is associated with chronic stress. And ultimately, if again, the goal is to foster better quality sleep for the child, that probably is also going to foster better sleep for the parent. And ultimately, if the parent's sleeping better, the parents are going to be less stressed, and that's going to increase the overall stress in the home.
Yeah. So there's a little bit of stress is good, but not too much.
Right.
Okay. Which is
balance. Yeah. Balance in all things, as my mother says.
And this question has to do with COVID, and it's, how can we help our kids explore during pandemic time?
That's a really fun question. What do I want to say about that? I'm not entirely sure what the person means by explore, but my first thought is nature has so many health benefits. There's a lot of research studies showing that anytime we can get out in nature, that will boost our moods and decrease stress and ultimately foster, promote well-being. So while it can be difficult to get out and be out, right? Because there's a fear maybe of interacting with a lot of other people, it is really safe to be outside and be, if you can get to the woods or get up to a park or go for walks, anything really that you can do to change the scenery a little bit, promote curiosity. So I know that, some parents will get a little book of like 10 different kinds of trees and let's go look for these trees, or you can count like the different kinds of trees that you're seeing or the different plants that you're seeing. And also, if we're talking about young kids, I think it's good to do pretend play, and what's sometimes called role play or imaginative play can be really beneficial, especially in my line of work where we look at children's ability to take other people's perspectives. There's a lot of evidence that if you do pretend play with your kids, that can help promote their ability to perspective take. So if you pretend you're a teacher and you have students, or pretend you're a superhero, or just pretending any kind of like different roles or scenarios. My sister-in-law and I did this fun thing. It was a 5-year-old's birthday. And because of the pandemic, she wasn't going to have a birthday party. And so instead they went to the woods, and we went ahead and planted like little magic beans. And we came up with a story where I left a message saying that I was queen of the forest fairy, and we had left behind some things for her to find. So it was a little bit like a treasure hunt.
Yeah.
There's also this is a activity that is becoming more popular now, but it's been around for a while, and that's geocaching. You can go on a different website, and all over the parks in Vancouver and other places, people have hid little caches of like sometimes they're just little notes or little toys. And you look up the GPS coordinates on your phone, and then you can go through the park and find these. This has been around for many years, but it's become a lot more popular, I think, during the pandemic as something that the kids can really get excited about doing. So you could look up geocaching opportunities.
I feel like I think it'll be great to add some of these links to the email I'll send to parents.
Oh, sure, yeah.
So that would be nice to add. I think it's something I'd even want to do myself with my friends, because it sounds really
I love it. Yeah, I do it all the time in the parks. It's sometimes it's just a little, like I found a rock with a character's face on it in a tree, and if you keep going along the path, there's several more of those little creatures that you can find and things like that.
That actually sounds really fun. Thank you so much for the answers. And this question is, how can I help my 2.5-year-old reduce her anxiety around family members and relatives that she doesn't see every day, or around strangers? Will children grow out of this stranger anxiety? And when is it considered serious?
Great. So there's a few parts to that question. So it's about stranger anxiety. Stranger anxiety is pretty normal. So most, if not all, kids will develop stranger anxiety. Initially, it starts as early as the end of the second half of the first year of life. So 6, 8, 9 months, it starts to peak. But a lot of individuals, this can persist for a number of years. There's a term researchers sometimes use called slow to warm up babies, which simply means that there are some individuals that by their nature are slower to warm up, in that they can be shyer, they can be a little bit more cautious about approaching strangers or approaching novel situations, but ultimately they get to the same end point. So it's not associated with, it's not typically associated with any long-term, any negative effects long-term. How serious is it? Well, I guess I would say it depends how often it's happening and how long it lasts. And ultimately, if it's affecting the child outside of those interactions. So if this is something that the child is talking about, or you feel like it's having effects outside of those short instances where he or she is interacting with a stranger, then it's worth, it's never a bad idea to talk about it with a doctor, even your primary care physician or a clinician. We actually have a bunch of wellness resources that I can give you, Portia, and we can share those with parents. A referral service in BC and a variety of resources, both online and in-person resources that could be helpful if you're concerned. But generally speaking, will my child grow out of stranger anxiety? Yes, most kids do grow out of stranger anxiety.
Okay. And there is a second part to this question, and it is how to help your child with selective mutism.
Okay. Selective mutism is, maybe I'll just say what it is for people that are listening, because it's relatively rare. I think it affects less than 1% of children. It's when a child is capable, it has the ability to speak, but under certain circumstances does not speak. So they're capable, they have the ability to produce language, but under certain situations or with certain individuals, they will be mute, as in they'll be silent and not speak. That can be, they'll interact, say, with family at home, but they will not speak at school or not speak with strangers or something like that. It used to be called elective mutism because initially people thought that they were choosing not to speak, that they were somehow being stubborn or defiant, and that's not the case. That's absolutely not the case. They're essentially physically not able to speak under certain circumstances, and researchers believe that has to do with high levels of social anxiety. So it's usually situations that are causing high anxiety for the individual that will make them not speak. My first piece of advice is, as hard as it is, but to be patient and know that they're not being stubborn or defiant, and they're not doing this on purpose. They very much want to speak. So I would highly recommend in that case to seek advice from a clinician, and the earlier the better. It's possible, given that we're in a pandemic, we're probably all showing a little bit of stranger danger phenomenon, right? Because we're trying to keep a distance from people. It's possible the child might be picking up on that. And so depending on the age of the child, it might be helpful to talk to the child about their feelings, about their emotions. I'm a big advocate, regardless of the child's age, or to talk about your feelings, to ask them, what are you thinking? What are you feeling? How does that make you feel? And even talking about your own emotions as a parent, like, how do you feel about those people? Are you, if you're feeling stressed because of the pandemic, with older children, you could probably have that conversation. And the reason I say I'm a big advocate for talking about your feelings is sort of two-pronged. There's coming back to my research, the fact that talking about feelings and emotions and thoughts and intentions really helps foster perspective taking, and it can help them learn about mental states. So mental states are invisible. We can't see them. And that way, that kind of means the only way kids can really learn about them is if we talk about them, put labels on them. And so trying to use a lot of mental state terms and asking your child, how are you thinking? How are you feeling? Why do you feel that way? Can help foster perspective taking. But the other beautiful benefit of doing that is I think it really shows the child that the parent cares, right? They're involved. They care what they're thinking and what they're feeling. And that's always a good thing.
Yeah, that always feels nice, even now.
Yeah.
So we are at the last question for today, and this is kind of nice timing because we are running out of time now. So the last question is a two-part question, or almost a three-part question. And it's I'm a trainer for kids of 2 years to 6. I really want to know what differentiates kids globally. What is the major difference? Is it by genetic and environment? And how will that influence their future? And for the future, what should we do, or how should we prepare them?
Oh, wow, that's a big question.
Loaded question.
Let me see, how do I want to tackle that? Okay, so the first part of the question is what differentiates kids globally?
Yeah.
And what's the major difference? I think what they're asking is, are there big cultural differences or big differences, kids growing up in different parts of the world? There are some cultural differences, but I would say by far there's more individual differences within kids within a cultural group than there is between cultural groups. Do you know what I mean? Like, researchers have studied this for a long time, and there's way more aspects of child development that are universal than are different. In fact, a lot of the cultural differences are pretty small and pretty subtle. And so, in terms of interacting with kids or teaching kids, I wouldn't change the way I interacted with them based on their cultural background. I would actually gauge it based on their individual behavior, right? Because within within a cultural group, there's way more differences. Some kids are shy, and some kids are much more outgoing, and some kids are somewhere in the middle where they're slow to warm up. And that's true in all cultures, right? We see shy kids in every culture. We see extroverted kids in every culture. And so I think I would pay more attention to their individual personality style, if you will, than anything to do with their cultural background. The second part of that question was, will you read me the question again?
Yeah. So reading the whole question, I'm a trainer of kids of 2 years to 6. I really want to know what differentiates kids globally. What is the major difference by genetic, environment, and how will that influence their future? For the future, what should we do, or how should we prepare them?
Great. Okay. So by genetic or environment, what's the major difference? I think if we're talking about cultural groups, we really don't see genetic differences. There are far more environmental differences that have to do with, cultural traditions, differences in the languages that are spoke, differences in what's given priority, differences in access to legal resources. Maybe one of the biggest ones is actually social economic status and the differences that exist culturally. So financial backgrounds can certainly play a role in shaping development. So I would say genetic versus environment. When we're talking about cultural differences, I think a lot more of it is environmental differences. And how can we prepare them for the future? I think for that, I would come back again to conversations with your kids. Like, it really does boil down to making them feel heard, making them feel like they can talk to you about their emotions, and that you talk to them about your emotions, right? That's how they will learn good emotion regulation strategies, good strategies for coping. It will be helpful for them to understand what situations cause you stress and how you cope with that stress. So yeah, I think preparing them for the future, it comes down to listening and talking to them.
Thank you so much, Sue, for all the questions, for answering all these questions, and giving us more insights into how children develop socially and perspective taking. I think there's a lot to take from this conversation. I just want to thank all the parents for your questions and for spending your afternoon with us. Before we wrap up today's Q&A session, I'd like to share an exciting study being done at Dr. Birch's Research Center. This study is a 30 to 40 minute survey, and parents with For parents with children between the ages of 3 to 12, Dr. Birch and her incredible research team are examining relationships between how children and their parents reason about other people and various aspects of social, emotional health, and well-being. Participants will also be entered into a draw to win a $50 gift card, 1 in a 25 chance. If this sounds like something you'd be interested in participating in, you can use the link displayed here. This link will also be included in an email you will receive at the end of this event for your convenience. Dr. Birch has also provided a list of wellness resources for parents who might be in need of any of these services. We'll also be sharing these resources on our website for your convenience, so don't feel like you need to take note of everything now. But this is here in case you want to screenshot or anything of that sort, but it would be also on the EDRG website. Well, thank you all so much once again for joining us today and for the very interesting questions that came up. I'd also like to use this moment to thank all the families that have participated in some of the research being done at the EDRG, including those being done by Dr. Birch and her team. Our research is only possible because of amazing families like yours. And now more than ever, we need help in reaching more families to expand the EDRG family, to invite parents and their kids to join in on the fun happening at the EDRG, and to also expand our understanding of child development. If you're interested in participating with us, you can use a QR code here or the link that will be included in the email to sign up to receive more information about studies that you and your little one may be eligible for. Thank you once again, and we hope to see you at the next Q&A session with Dr. Ovdik on early math education. I hope you all have a great weekend and hope to see you again. Thank you so much, Dr. Souza.
Thank you, Portia, and thanks for coming, everybody. Great questions.